How can we use the difficult stories of our past to develop the safety solutions of our present and future? Hey, this is Mark Reed from Pre-Site Safety, and you're listening to the Pre-Site Podcast. Welcome along to episode 8 of the Pre-Site Podcast. On the programme today, we're moving from stories of the past to technologies of the present and future. What you're about to hear is an interview between myself and Katrina Kramer, science correspondent for Chemistry World. Katrina kindly interviewed me to discuss a safety-focused research project that recently concluded in my team at the University of Strathclyde in collaboration with friends and colleagues at the Glasgow School of Art. Katrina and I discuss specifically virtual reality and how we've used that to build and design a safety training platform for a very specific purpose within the chemical sector. And we discuss the sorts of disasters and accidents that we are trying to prevent through the design of this virtual reality platform. And we also discuss the motivations behind this work and how it ties to stories that we've told in previous episodes of the Pre-Site Podcast. I'm really grateful to Katrina for doing this interview. It turned out to be a little bit more wide-ranging than I expected, and I really enjoyed the opportunity to speak about some of these things out loud. This was not an easy project to get off the ground back in 2017. It wasn't easy to get funded, it wasn't easy to get buy-in, but without the help and support of the colleagues around me, it never would have been, and I'm really excited to tell you about this now. But without further ado, please enjoy this extended interview between myself and Katrina Kramer, which you can now also read about in an article that I'll link below the podcast today and that you can check out after listening.
Fantastic. So I was wondering if you could start me off by telling me a little bit about the background and how the study came about.
Okay. There's sort of two threads to that. The first is it was more of a personal beginning than it was a scientific or professional one. So I'd grown up with my dad, who'd survived a major oil rig disaster in the late 1980s. And, had grown up with his stories of him surviving that ordeal. And I've written and spoken about that a lot now, but the main point of it is hearing a lot about how he made it off an oil rig that was ablaze, and so many of his colleagues at the time didn't. Mm. And what I didn't really understand at the time is that had sort of stayed with me as the thought of not really understanding how he was able to do that and others weren't, and just a curiosity as to how things might have been so very different for us as it was for a lot of others. But then that was throughout my younger years, but it was only really in 2016-17 when I was making the transition from postdoc to my first independent academic role that I got more interested in a lot of the articles that I was seeing coming out of Chemistry World and other publications with regards to a lot of the accidents that were happening in our world of chemistry rather than the oil and gas world that I'd grown up with. And this was, in labs, and it was also in factories and plants the size that would rival the oil rig that my father was on when that exploded. And so at that time, when I was first getting into academia independently, I thought that might be a good time to maybe try to look at safety through a different lens. It's always very tempting to see it as the boring task, the have-to task, the thing that you need to tick the box on before you get into the lab and do the really cool stuff. But having seen all of those articles that just seem to keep coming out, more accidents across all parts of the world as if weekly, I thought, well, why don't we try to make safety more of an interesting investment, something that is a really core part of what someone wants to do alongside the chemistry that they're really trying to do in the lab. And that's when I started toying with the idea of the new trends in technology that were really on the rise at that time, and virtual reality was one of those. And the sort of funny side story to this is that it could have so easily stopped there, just as I thought. But before we started any research, got anywhere near a paper, before anything was done practically at all, I had to chap a lot of doors and send a lot of emails to try and find a collaborator who could help get such an idea off the ground. It was too new for me in academia. I didn't really know what I was doing. I was very new to that game and busy trying to get my feet under the table of starting my first lab. So I really wanted to find someone I could work with to do any sort of work or apply for any grant that would make that a reality, trying virtual reality for safety. And after several months of being ignored or just hearing thanks but no thanks, I came across my now friend and colleague Matthew Poyada, who had eventually published this paper with. I was based at Strathclyde University at the time. He's based at the Glasgow School of Art. And I'd reached out to his colleague Daniel Livingston, who said, come over and see us. Long story short, I met Matthew through that interaction. And it was only after he really understood what I was rabbling about and trying to get across with regards to how serious the safety concerns were in chemistry, that he was willing to collaborate with me, and together we put together several grant applications before being able to do the work that has now eventually been published in this paper. So all of that is a long way to say it's been about 4 or 5 years in the making at this point. Personal hurdles in the beginning, then professional hurdles just to be able to fire the starting gun and do that research. But I'm so glad that we did it in the end, and I think we'll be able to do a lot more in this space.
So I was wondering if you can tell me a little bit more about, what you feel is wrong or not quite right with the way safety is currently taught.
I think we're at a transition point in that we're still in a time where much of safety training is done on legacy media. And by that, I mean, we're still reading a lot of forums, looking at a lot of slide decks, or perhaps even watching video recordings of someone talk about things that can go wrong, which is an absolute necessity. But the reason it's a transition is I think now there's an opportunity to evolve that approach to make it more of a psychological investment in chemistry trainees' minds. It's not that boring passive task like the legacy media tempts us into seeing safety training as. Safety is something where we really need better ways to see what the long-term impact of an accident, no matter how rare that accident is, can be. And that point there on the longer term thing was what really had stayed with me from what I mentioned about my dad's story, because it took a very, very long time after that accident in the 80s to see what the real lasting impact on a personal basis would be. He struggled with post-traumatic stress. Many people who are involved in such accidents, indeed in the chemical sector as well as any other, suffer from such psychological struggles as well. And so if you think about the challenge in safety training, not just being the media that it's on, but the fullness of the story that isn't quite portrayed at this stage, you will hear about things that can go wrong. You might even hear the odd story or two about accidents that have happened in the past, but then it kind of stops there. There is no story that continues into what happened 1 year, 2 year, 5 years, 10 years down the line. And that's, I think, beyond safety, that's just a really difficult part of the human condition, it's very difficult to think about anything in the very long term, because the further away you think, the more vague and abstract it becomes. But it's that very challenge that I think could make safety training more valuable psychologically, as well as evolving it onto more sophisticated media, the likes of which, augmented or virtual reality plays a part.
So do you think it's, apart from the way it is taught in terms of the delivery, do you feel there's not enough talk about, as you say, the accidents and the long-term implications? I guess particularly in the industries that have had those accidents happen, I don't know how likely they are to talk about them.
Indeed, yeah. There is a dichotomy there. So, if I was playing my own devil's advocate, I would say, this is wrong. Of course, we hear about accidents all the time. I've mentioned the likes of Chemistry World and related publications telling these stories in written form. So those do appear. That's not what I'm contesting here at all. And I think there's a fantastic job being done on that front. It's the longer term part of these stories that are more difficult to source, more difficult to tell, but nonetheless very necessary to hear more about.
And I'm also thinking, like, while the training is delivered, I'm not sure how likely, for example, a big company like GSK is to actually kind of analyze their own accidents. I don't know if you know anything about whether this is the case, if that is being done.
Yeah, well, that's the sort of apparent dichotomy I mentioned that I didn't finish that thought on there, is that, there's the clear benefit to analysing accidents and investing in better training, because it's a preemptive strike, if you like, against such disasters happening. It can help reduce the risk of them without them ever happening. And in the beginning, that thought process might have stopped there. I had the sort of rather cynical assumption that there would be more of a temptation to sweep a lot of accidents or wrongdoing under the carpet, so to speak. But, if I take the example of the article we've produced that we're talking about today, the key industrial partner in that work was GSK, who you've just mentioned. And my delightful surprise when I first walked through the reception doors at the chemical plant in Ayrshire was to see that safety was the thing that was on all the branding. It was the cups, the medals, the recognitions, and all the cabinets that you could see in reception. It was more on that investment in people and personnel and their safety up front, more so than it was the chemistry, the valuable and highly profitable chemistry that was being produced at that plant. That was part of it. But what I wasn't expecting at that early stage, before I knew much about this world, was just how front and centre and high on the priority list that safety was here. And it was really endearing to see. So in fact, I think in most cases, companies like that have more of an investment and priority in safety than you might assume before you study anything about safety.
Okay.
My last thought on that is, at the same time, that's not to say that every company is as good as that. There's many companies that we could name here that are on that same level. But that's not the case uniformly throughout the globe. There are other parts of the world where safety ethos, safety culture is not as advanced. It's not taken as seriously as it should be. And you can see that reflected in the global statistics from the likes of, disaster epidemiology databases, which can, show the heterogeneity across the planet. There's more accidents in some parts of the world than there are in others. And that's reflected as the root cause, and how poor some of the safety culture and procedures are in some companies versus others.
Okay. Thank you very much. So going a little bit more into the VR study, why specifically did you decide to choose VR as a training tool as opposed to any other, like, interactive new media, let's say?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I emphasize again, VR is part of a broader spectrum of newer technologies that one could investigate now or in the future. That's why I say there's a transition point here. There's a growing, there's a growing toolkit that you could choose from here, and they're just not fully adopted in chemistry yet. But at the time we started this work, virtual reality was starting to come to maturity. The time was right to look at virtual reality more seriously. It had been applied in gaming, virtual concert experiences, other parts of large-scale manufacturing industries, engineering, and alongside that momentum, the availability of the hardware to do VR studies and the accessibility of writing software and modeling assets for VR was coming to a level of maturity that it was no longer, a Star Trek style whimsical idea. It was very much something that could be practically applied. And as well as the timing and accessibility of the technology, it was at the time for us the one that had the connection to where this all started. I mentioned how my dad had made it off a platform and others didn't. In the GlaxoSmithKline case, it wasn't burning oil or an explosion or a fire, but a gas leak that could cause just as much damage. But the underlying question remained the same, was what if you could show people this sort of disaster happening before the real thing ever took place? And so virtual reality was the perfect fit for that, because you can simulate accidents and disasters, the likes of which you can never recreate as part of a traditional training module. And in fact, when we started this work, one of the ways that trainees on the GSK site were taught about gas leaks was to be shown CCTV footage of it happening elsewhere. But nothing could ever be more realistically recreated than that. So virtual reality was a perfect fit for that problem, to create accidents and help people experience it more so than they can through a PowerPoint slide deck or any video that they might be shown.
Okay. And I was wondering if you could tell me briefly about the participants, because I feel it's kind of interesting to know what kind of background they had, if they were digitally savvy, like these kinds of things that might, increase or decrease their experience with VR, I guess.
Yeah, it's another great point, and something we mentioned directly in our study. When we started, the first round of participants that we tested the Emergent VR platform with were the staff members who would use such a training, those who were working on the GSK site and directly involved with the complex tasks and the risk of the disasters like gas leaks that I've mentioned just a moment ago. But in those staff members was a clear demographic of, at that time, being a bit older, 40s plus, some of whom were tech savvy, some of whom weren't. There was a few younger people, but it was primarily older. So that was a good first run. That was, if you like, our alpha test to see if the staff members would be receptive. So it was highly appropriate to do that. But for the scientific study, we saw the clear need at that point to be able to look at a wider pool of participants at the other end of the demographic spectrum. And so after that, when we did the more formal study, we reached out to students and staff across our respective institutions as part of our collaboration. And we managed to get, I think, between 40 and 50 participants in the end, with a more equal distribution of male and female, younger people who are more tech savvy, and crucially, more likely to be in the next generation of staff to take on the roles that we were interested in training for on this industrial site. So in the end, with both of those studies, the one on the staff members and the one with a broader pool of younger students, you sort of covered the present case study of who would be in the roles now and who you would have to train up with this more technologically advanced training platform, and those who would be coming into the same roles in 5 or 10 years' time, and seeing how they would respond to such a training.
And in terms of what kind of background they had in terms of previous safety training? Were those, for example, the students, were they chemistry students, did they know anything about industrial safety? Because I guess if you're generally familiar with having worked on the site, you might experience it differently, I guess.
Yeah, most had never experienced any sort of training like that before. You know, a lot of what people should be aware broadly when they're doing any sort of study like this is the conclusions you make can, if you're not careful, can be subject to your own network. You know, I'm a chemist with industrial training, so if I wasn't careful, we could have only chemists with industrial training as part of that study and heavily biased the outcomes. And that was the benefit of having, you know, a collaborative team, you know, who was partly based in chemistry at Strathclyde, but partly based doing VR work at the School of Art, and having a broader network wherein we could be confident. And we captured all this data in the paper to say that there was some chemists amongst that demographic for that part of the study, but there was also people who had, you know, never drawn a molecule in their lives, don't know what a curly arrow is from Adam. You know, there's it was that broad in the end. And you know, even with that confidence, and this goes for anyone who does any sort of study like this going forward, as much as you've analysed it statistically, make the raw data available so that someone else can draw the same inferences you have or reanalyze it. It's really important to provide all of that raw data, because there's always a chance in psychological studies like that you let bias creep in without ever knowing it. So we've been as robust as we can, but I think the one thing I would advise for others going forward is pay very close attention to the demographic that you're able to access from the very beginning, to minimize the risk of bias creeping in from the beginning.
Even though I guess if such a training were implemented, it would be aimed at a fairly, I guess, narrow demographic of people who are working in these plants and who are potentially already familiar with certain safety procedures. Yeah,
exactly. That's why, and then we were very comfortable with having done, you know, the rather two extremes, if you like, in terms of participant studies. You know, those who were it was specifically targeted for in the first place, and those who might approach those roles in the future. So that it helped us cover more bases. But you're right, if you think about, you know, if you move away from the specifics of what we've done in this study, the most attractive applications of VR that are out there now are those that are very specific to a certain group of people, let's say within a company doing a certain task and training for a certain role. You know, the more specific it is, the more engaged someone is likely to be in that task. You're showing them something that they're going to care about anyway, but doing so in a way that's more naturally engaging and immersive for them than would the traditional legacy media allow for.
So can you tell me a little bit about what you found? Because from what I understand, the actual scores of, you know, what they learned on the exam afterwards were pretty similar across the two methods.
Yes, there's two crucial parts to this. One is if you're trying to investigate or promote a new way of training, you absolutely have to compare it against what's available already. You know, what's the normal way, it's the traditional way of doing things. So in our case, it was the new VR type training versus traditional classroom PowerPoint slide deck enabled training. And so when you're assessing one of those trainings versus the other, A versus B, the first thing you're doing is giving folks a test at the end, like an exam. How much of the task that they're training for have they picked up? How much specific knowledge have they acquired? And you're absolutely right. On that first part of the assessment, you find that both training exercises enable the same level of knowledge acquisition, which might be the first counterintuitive thing. You might think because the VR is new and fancy and more technologically advanced that people will automatically learn more. But what we found at least in our study, statistically speaking, is that they learned almost exactly the same amount. There was no statistical difference. They picked up the same sort of knowledge that they had to. Where the crucial difference came was when we looked more specifically at the sorts of measures that one would use if you're developing a video game. What are the levels of presence in the training? That is to say, how engaged is the trainee? How much do they believe that it's real to life? How much do they feel that they can reach out and touch the environment? And in almost every measure we could come across, that's where VR shone over the more traditional media. Every statistical measure we threw at it, we found that the trainees who went for VR over the traditional training were more involved, were reaching out and touching things, moving around as if it was the real place, could recognise in the case of the staff that it was part of their site. And going forward, the more that VR advances on sister technologies like it, the more you can be more confident in saying that one day, yes, VR probably will enable people to learn more about the specific task, as well as being more engaged in that task. And that might just be new tweaks on user interfaces, new things embedded in VR that aren't available yet. But what we've seen and what we would conclude from our studies, that's where the trajectory is. VR is where you should go if you want people to be more engaged and invested in the training that they're taking part in.
What I would be interested in is whether you compared or consider to compare VR to another interactive but non-immersive experience. So like having a VR, but as a computer type game without the headset and without the whatever thing called for the hands.
Yeah. Well, I'll try to be brief. There is a longer story behind that. The short answer is yes. And that's part of ongoing work that, a third dimension of comparison here would be to record the virtual reality experience from someone who's going through that and show that as part of a non-immersive variant of the same training. So in other words, have a sort of VR version of a screen recording as someone's going through the VR training, and then use that screen recording in something like a PowerPoint slide deck as a bridge between the fully traditional old style classroom training and the more technological immersive VR experience. That's where we're going next to flesh out a fuller element of this story. And in fact, we've made a version of that sort of screen recording of the training available as part of the support and information for the study that we're talking about. So it's a really important thing to do. Other things you could do here is then, compare virtual reality to some version of augmented reality where it's a blend of, computational support on a screen or on safety glasses or a safety helmet, merged with the real world itself. Almost Terminator style is the way I like to explain it a lot of the time. It's, you're walking in the real world, but you're having additional information appended to that world to assist with your decision making. So there's a lot of A versus B comparisons that you could start to make now. And as you've rightly pointed out, A versus B versus C, to look at the in-between case of moving from one extreme of training to another.
Okay. And in terms of the experience people actually receive, because you said it's important for people to understand, how accidents happen and what to do.
Yes.
From what I understand, the experience you gave them in VR did not include anything, bad happening if they did something wrong. They just couldn't proceed.
So in the paper that we've just released, the focus was on primarily comparing the old training to the new for doing the standard task of going from the start A all the way through to the perfect finishing case B. What we've also done as part of this work is to create branch points of C and D. What happens if you don't make it all the way through to B, but in fact a gas leak does occur? What if someone has to look at where the emergency stops are and consider wind direction, and look at where, if there are other colleagues or personnel on the same site at the same time? And that's what we're working on now, is looking at how you embed that additional complexity of what happens when stuff goes wrong. And that's when you get to the point of saying, what I mentioned was the original question all along. What if you can show people what goes wrong without ever having to recreate it in real life, or what you are not allowed to recreate in real life as part of a training experience?
And I was wondering, what do you see are the advantages or disadvantages for companies implementing VR training in terms of things like cost, time, effectiveness?
Yeah, a lot of interesting questions there. I think the understandable assumption in most cases is that it can be expensive. But that is just really the world of business. It depends where you go, who you look at, what they can offer. Prices will vary, and inevitably, with all such technologies, as they advance, prices come down. That would be the con, if you like, is just trying to figure out whether something genuinely is as expensive as you assume, or find someone you can work with who can do it at an attractive cost. The benefits are much more easy to speak about, because not just in our study, but in others we've been able to find like it, and more that are emerging. There is an increasing amount of evidence to say that the people in your care, the staff in your care, the people you want to not just train for a task, but make sure they get home safe at night, will be more likely to do so if you give them the most engaging training you possibly can. And that might sound like overselling it, but what I'm really tapping into there is really the eternal challenge of any safety training for any company, or indeed any university. It's being able to see the benefits of preventing accidents and not simply reacting to any accident that might unfortunately have already occurred.
Do you know of any areas, like within science or elsewhere, that already implement some form of kind of non-traditional training?
Yeah, and it's a perfect way really to tie in another part of this whole story, because one thing I found out quickly is, because I dare say chemistry is perhaps a little bit behind in the adoption of such technologies, more so than those in more electrical or mechanical engineering domains. I found it very, very difficult to find a funding source in the beginning, and already had started toying with the ideas of looking at more entrepreneurial or business focused approaches to this. But to your very question, those who supported this study in the beginning were at the time known as the Advanced Form and Research Centre, attached to the University of Strathclyde. And that's really an engineering focused arm that deals with large scale manufacturing and safety concerns that aren't really to do with chemistry, but materials development, equipment development. And they really opened my eyes to just how far this had come, even although it looked as if it wasn't really in the sights of chemistry. This is stuff that was known, loved, adopted, and used as if normal in other parts of STEM outside of chemistry. And the likes of the Advanced Form and Research Centre were using virtual reality to not just walk through their sites, but help design their sites before they were ever made. And not just using virtual reality, but also the sister technology I've mentioned a couple of times, augmented reality, and using that as a way to step through different parts of their large industrial equipment safely and to understand them before ever walking amongst that equipment in real life. So it is really inspiring, I think, for any of us in chemistry to look sideways at other industries that we might see as alien or completely outside our domain, but it can really teach us something about the adoption of advanced technologies that aren't far in the future. They're here and available right now.
So what is next for you in your research? Because you mentioned obviously quite a couple of things. What is like the immediate next step for you?
Well, in terms of safety, sticking with the thread of this piece, it's looking more at the simulation of accidents and how people respond psychologically to that. We're also looking at some other ways to assess long-term thinking in terms of safety. That's primarily where it's going in the safety domain. As I'd mentioned at the top of our call, I've just started a new UKRI fellowship this week, and that's looking at a different type of modern technology and computer vision using cameras and recordings to understand in a more data-dense fashion some of the chemistry that goes on the smallest and largest scales. But even within that technology, there's opportunities to look at how we might do things in a safer and more productive way. There's a breadth of stuff going on, but safety will always remain a central theme as a practical output for what we do. I feel very excited and privileged about that. It's only the very beginning of it in early days, but we'll keep going.
Fantastic. Well, congratulations on the grant, definitely. Thank you so much for your time.
No trouble, Katrina. I really enjoyed that. Yeah, reach out anytime. Thanks.
Have a good rest of your day. Thank you.
You too. Bye.
Bye.
If you like what you've heard, you can find more from the Pre-Site podcast and all our related articles on our website at pre-site-safety.co. That's pre-site-safety.co. We'll see you next time for another episode of the Pre-Site podcast. Be well.